Hey guys, today we are going to be talking about three of the most basic concepts in logic. Basic in the sense that these are kind of the three ingredients that you need to understand in order to understand everything else from here on out in the semester. And these concepts are claim, truth, and contradiction. So I really want to spend some time on these three things to make sure it's clear. And if you ever have any issues with these things, always feel free to reach out because, again, this is kind of like the bottom of the pyramid. Everything from here on out is building upon these concepts. So if you don't have that solid foundation, we're going to struggle. And it's also important to understand that these three concepts are interrelated. You kind of can't know about one completely without understanding how it relates to these other things. And I think that you're going to see this when we have the discussion because things will naturally flow into one another. And I think on the syllabus I explained that logic is all about understanding reality and evaluating arguments about reality. And since ultimately we're going to be dealing with arguments, we have to start with step one, which is claim, right? So a claim is a word, this happens a lot of time in philosophy, that we hear in everyday life, so to speak, and think that it means one thing. But it actually winds up having a slightly different or completely different technical meaning within, logic or philosophy or whatever discipline. So, what exactly is a claim? Right? Well, we know it means you saying something, right? Everyone knows that much, but what exactly is it? So, when philosophers and logicians talk about claims, they're referring to something very specific. First and foremost, they're referring to a linguistic utterance. So what do we mean by that? An utterance is something you say, right? Something you write. And linguistic in the sense that, well, it has meaning and has a certain function and a certain structure and all that good stuff. So a claim is a kind of linguistic utterance. But it's not just that, because there are plenty of utterances, types of utterances, that aren't claims. A claim specifically is an utterance with what we call a truth value. And to have a truth value is a fancy way of saying is capable of being true or false. So if an utterance has a truth value, that means it's capable of being true or false. It doesn't mean it is true, like it's not true value. That would be a truth value of true. It's just a truth value, right? And this is important to understand because not all types of utterances have truth values. I'll give you a couple of examples of utterances that aren't claims. Number one, a question. If I said to you, hey, what's your favorite color? Do you like orange? Do you think brown and black go together? Those are questions, right? And they're linguistic and they have meaning and they're utterances, but they're not capable of being true or false. Like a question isn't true or a question isn't false. It's just a question, right? So questions are not claims. Or exclamations like, hey, right? That's an utterance that has meaning and serves a certain function, but it's also not capable of being true or false. It's just hey. Or if I punch something really hard and say, ouch, not a claim. Or if I command, right, or if someone commands you to do something, clean your room, don't do that, right? That's not a claim, right? At least not in any explicit sense because they're not declaring anything. Another way of understanding a claim is to say that it's a declarative statement, right? It declares something. It predicates something of something is another way of understanding it. So what would be an example of a claim? Start anywhere. I mean, the couch is red. That's a claim. But even if I said the couch is green, and you could kind of see some of the couch over there, that's still a claim, right? It's not a true claim, but it's still a claim, right? It doesn't have to be true to be considered a claim. Another example is, if I said, I am holding a marker right now in between my thumb and index finger. That's a claim, right? And it happens to be a true claim. But also if I said, I am not holding a marker between these two fingers, or the thing I'm holding is a book, also false, but these things are all claims. So that is important to understand. Now, of course, not all claims are equal. There are different types of claims, and that's something that we're going to get into in a later lesson. But for now, this is just kind of like the bare bones you need to understand. So when you're sitting there doing a quiz or just trying to piece everything together in your head or practicing this stuff, and you're thinking about, is this thing a claim? The only question you're concerned with is, can this thing be considered true or false? And if the answer to that question is yes, then it is a claim. And if the answer to that question is no, then it is not a claim. That's the basic. But notice how, in order to define this concept of claim, it requires us to have an understanding of another concept: truth. Right? The idea of claim only makes sense if we first have an idea of the concept of truth. And I presume that we must all have some kind of at least rudimentary understanding of the concept of truth. Otherwise, that explanation wouldn't have made any sense. And I assume it makes at least some sense. And hopefully it'll make more sense when we dig deeper into it. So we have to fully explain what truth even is. And this is interesting, right? Because usually in everyday conversation, and even when you do specific fields of study, right, or like practice activities within specific fields of studies, everyone kind of already assumes a certain standard of truth or a definition of truth, right? And that makes sense because you don't go around questioning things all the time if you want to function adequately or normally, right? But logic, philosophy in general, is all about thinking in slow motion, we say, and really trying to take the moves that we make at an incredibly fast speed mentally and slow them down and really think about what we mean, right? Because we kind of take things for granted, we make assumptions and all that stuff, and it's like, wait a second, what is truth, right? Because I go about my daily life saying this is true, that's not true, thinking about whether something's true or not true, but what does that even mean, right? So philosophers will often be in the weird position of defining these concepts that we often take for granted, that are often so fundamental that we don't even think about defining, right? We just think, oh yeah, I know what truth is. And this is, kind of some trouble Socrates got himself into, because he would ask these kinds of questions to people, and they would think they knew what they were talking about, really absolutely, oh, obviously truth is blank, right? Or goodness is blank. But what he would reveal is that oftentimes we don't know as much as we think we know, at least not at the onset. So what is this thing called truth, right? I mean, that's a difficult question. But luckily, when we're doing logic, we have a specific definition to work with. So if we think about one of the claims I made earlier, we can kind of do it indirectly. We'll start with the concrete claim and parse out the notion of truth from there. So here is a cup of tea, right? So if I said to you, I am holding a cup of tea in my right hand right now, you would say, that's true. Right? And remember, we might be mirror image, but trust me, it's true. But then if I said, I am holding a cup of tea in my left hand right now, you would say that's false, right? And then if I ask you, why? What is it that makes the first one true, that first statement true, and then the second claim false? Think about that for a second. And I know it might be a weird question because you're like, well, because you are holding the cup in your right hand and you're not holding the cup in your left hand. And like, right, that's true, but unpack what that means, right? Because one of the things I think the concept of truth requires us to understand is that there's a distinction between things and then things we say about things, right? Like there's reality or actuality, and then there's statements we make about actuality. And if you notice, since a claim is a linguistic utterance and is a true linguistic utterance, that means that truth is not actuality itself, but it's a certain relationship that our claims have to reality. And that relationship is one of correspondence. What does that mean? Well, first of all, it's not like sending letters to one another, right? Because you think like, oh, there was a correspondence between Prince whatever and whatever. That's not what it means, at least in this context. A correspondence is a matching up, right? Something lines up with something. Something accurately depicts something, right? Something matches, I always say. So the question is, will a correspondence between what? Well, think again between what I said earlier about language and reality. So let's say there is something, and then there's person, right? There's like an object, and this distinction is kind of important in philosophy, an object and a subject. Then let's say this person makes a claim. They say, that is a cube. All right, that's all it says. That is a cube. I know it's small. So we would say, to simplify things, let's call this actuality, and then let's call this the claim, right? I don't know why I'm putting this in quotes. Oops. So if this person claimed this is a cube, we would say that is true. That claim is true, right? Why? Because the claim corresponds to actuality. That's what it means for something to be true, is that it corresponds to a state of affairs out in the world, right? Or it corresponds to the thing being talked about, right? The thing pointed at by the linguistic act, so to speak. And then conversely, if this person said, that is a tree, right? Or something weird like that, you'd say, no, that's false. And that makes sense that you would say it's false, right? Because that claim does not correspond to actuality. So at the end of the day, a claim is a linguistic utterance with a truth value, and truth is a correspondence between the claim and some actual state of affairs that the claim is about, right? That's maybe a lot to take in, but I think you want to not psych yourself out, because I feel like this always happens in the beginning of a philosophy class, because you're like, whoa, this stuff, I never thought about this. But I want to make sure you understand that a lot of the things we talk about are actually really literal. And they're so literal, in fact, that they seem not literal. Like, they seem overly complex when actually it's like, no, we're talking about a specific thing, that thing you already understand, kind of, we're just unpacking what that means. So it's abstract, but abstract doesn't mean like fake or unrelated. Abstract just means you're talking in terms of conceptual principles and not actual things, right? It's like talking about the concept of markers in general and not just like one particular marker, right? So the level of abstraction here is clearly evident, but it's about something that isn't difficult. And if you think about it, it's not difficult, I promise. I always say, like, don't psych yourself out, just because it happens all the time, right? So, okay, we understand what a claim is. We understand what truth is. And actually, let me back up for a second, because I forgot to say, one thing you'll notice about truth and correspondence is that this is an objective endeavor. What does it mean for something to be objective? Well, that's a conversation in itself. But to give a kind of overview here, to say that something is objective is to say that whatever it is that independent of your personal feelings about it, right? So this is a cup of green tea and not like a photo, right? And if I say this is a cup of green tea, that claim is true, and it's true regardless of if you disagree with it. Like, you could scream until you're blue in the face and say, no, this isn't a cup of green tea, this is a book or a photo. And your feeling that way does not change actuality, and so therefore does not change the relationship that the claim has to reality, right? So it's not about your feelings. It's not about opinion, right? That's another word that gets tossed around because I think it's an oversimplification of a term. But anyway, it's not as if reality bends around you, right? Because how long has it been since you've been in the classroom? But when last time I was in a classroom, and whenever we go over this, someone, at least one person, undoubtedly starts talking about how truth is like what you believe. And they'll get into this concept of like my truth, right? Oh, this is my truth, right? And I always spend a lot of time talking about that because it's a common conception that people have, and it gets us into a lot of trouble. There is no my truth kind of thing, right? Like, we don't want to go around thinking that the world bends around us, so to speak. That, oh, and just because I think it or just because I feel it, that means it's true, right? That's not true. And the example I always give is, if I sat here and told you, like, oh, you know, in my apartment, at every night at 9:04 p.m., there is this little leprechaun that like sits in the corner, like juggling and playing with dominoes. That's not true, right? That's not real. And inevitably someone always says, yeah, but you believe that, so that's your truth. And I'm like, right, but that doesn't make it true, right? Truth is not merely a belief. It's a belief that corresponds to actuality. And I often will give like a dramatic example to explain why that it's not accurate to say like, oh, it's just something you believe, and it's a my truth type of thing, right? It's totally subjective. And here's the dramatic example. Let's say that I accused you of breaking into my apartment last night and assaulting me. And I go out in the world and say, like, hey, this person broke into my apartment last night and assaulted me. And you're like, what? I didn't do that. I was, in another state last night, or I was asleep at that time. You have like some perfectly good alibi. Imagine if I then said, well, no, but you did because I believe you did. And as long as I believe you broke into my apartment and assaulted me, then it must be true. That'd be crazy, right? And like, imagine if you went to court, right? And this went to, the judge, and the judge said, well, I know you've presented all this evidence for why you couldn't have been in. And so imagine if this went in front of a judge, and the judge said, well, I know you presented all of this so-called evidence for why you weren't and could not have been in Professor Seeley's apartment, but he believes you were, so it's true, right? Again, it's wrong, because no matter how much I feel like you did that, right, or I claim that you did that, it doesn't make actuality that, right? It doesn't result in that actually happening. And it's important to understand that when we talk about truth, we're talking about something objective, something that is not merely personal belief. If something is true, it is true for everyone, right? And you may be thinking, oh, what about like preferences and personal morals and things like that? That's different, right? If we're talking about that, we're kind of using the word truth differently. So when we talk about truth and logic, we're talking about making these claims about states of affairs, right? About concepts, about things out in the world, about events, right? And those are all things that could be publicly accessed in some sense. So it's capable of being verified or falsified, right? So I know that maybe seemed like a tangent, but it's very, very important to understand. So we understand what a claim is. We understand what truth is. And I mentioned at the beginning of the video that we were going to talk about contradictions. And let's do that, right? Because I think this is an important idea. So this is another one of those terms that you will have heard before, undoubtedly, right? Like you've heard the word contradiction, and you probably think you have at least some understanding of what that means. Maybe. And so the job right now is to kind of explain what a contradiction is and what a contradiction isn't. And at a very base level, if you think of a contradiction, some root ingredient in that will be like there's some kind of opposition. It's like, okay, that much is true. There's a tension between two things. But most people have this idea that a contradiction is like, oh, she said that she doesn't like to dance, but I saw her dancing last weekend. That's not a contradiction, actually. That's just someone being hypocritical. That's someone saying one thing and doing another. That's not what a contradiction is in logic. A contradiction is something much more specific. And there are a couple of different ways we could say this. So let's think of the most basic, and by that I mean the most general way of talking about it. We can say a contradiction is, what happens when one asserts the co-occurrence, I hope that's spelled right, of variables that are metaphysically impossible to co-occur. So it's what happens when one asserts that these two things are happening simultaneously. However, it is actually metaphysically impossible for those two things to both be happening, to both be true. And so you look at this definition, and the first thing you think to yourself is, what does this mean? What does that mean? Okay, well, think about when someone says, like, oh, that's physically impossible. So it's physically impossible for humans to fly, for example. on their own accord, right? Because obviously you could use a hang glider, you could use tools in the plane, whatever. But I mean, like, it's impossible for a human to jump off a cliff and do that and fly, right? Physically impossible. However, you can imagine someone flying, right? It's physically impossible, but you can still imagine it hypothetically, right? Like in fantasy. Metaphysical impossibility is when it cannot even be imagined. So while it is physically impossible for a human to flap their arms and fly, they don't have wings, it is certainly not metaphysically impossible because you can imagine it. And the question is now, okay, well, what's metaphysically impossible? That's the right question to ask. And to understand that, we have to understand a little bit about these basic logical laws. So the most fundamental law in logic is this thing called the law of identity. And the law of identity, very simply, is this idea that A equals A. And no, that's not literally about the letter A, it's just a variable. And so another way of saying this would be to say, something is the thing that it is. That's all that means. And this is another one of those things where people are like, what? Like, that's so confusing, but it's not, I promise. It's exactly what it sounds like, right? A thing is necessarily the thing that it is, right? Like, this marker is this marker and not this pencil, right? This board is a board and not a cat, right? And part of the reason why something is the thing that it is because something is not what it is not, right? So that's like a negative way of saying that. And from this comes this second principle, which we call the law of non-contradiction. And the law of contradiction states that A is not A. Or in other words, a thing is not the thing that it is not. Right? The cup is not a not cup. Green is not blue. Chair is not tree. Right? Like it doesn't matter. You can put any variable in it. And this is, again, don't let it go over your head. It's very, very basic. Now, this is where metaphysical impossibility comes into the picture. So when we say that a contradiction is impossible even to be imagined, we mean this. If someone says A is not A, that's garbage, right? Like, that's a contradiction. And it's a contradiction because a thing cannot be the thing that it is not, right? Something is not its opposite. Two mutually exclusive items cannot co-occur. And again, this is not just physically impossible. This is metaphysically, like, it's extra impossible, right? Like, it can't even be imagined. In no possible world could it happen. So what are practical examples of this? Okay. Three-sided square, right? So let me write some of these down so you have some kind of reference. Someone says three-sided square. That's a contradiction. Because a square, by definition, is something with four sides. So something that necessarily has four sides cannot have three sides. The definitions just, like, they can't work together. Or it's like if someone said, I am, let me think of like an easy example. I am an architect, but I'm not an architect. Right? And you might say, yeah, but what if you mean it in one sense here and then another sense here? That's not what we're talking about, right? The law of non-contradiction, the long form version, which Aristotle posited, is that something cannot simultaneously be and not be in the same way and at the same time. That's what it means. So it's not to say that you can't like be an architect when you're 20 and then not be an architect when you're 30. It's merely to say that you cannot simultaneously be architect and not architect if the same definition is being used, right? That's all that means. Impossible. What's another example? Let's say I said, I've known you for 7 years, but I've known you for less than 3 years. Let's make something up. Right, that's another contradiction. Because to know someone for 7 years necessarily means to know them for more than 3 years. So you can't know someone for 7 years at the same time that you know them for less than 3 years. It doesn't make any sense. So take a step back to the example I gave before of hypocrisy, right? Where like someone says, I don't like to dance, but then they dance. That's not a contradiction. Why? Because it can happen. And you can imagine it. That happens all the time. People say one thing and do another. Therefore, it's not metaphysically impossible. So they're not actually contradictions. Now, on the other hand, if someone said, I'll give you 2 examples. So if someone says, I am not a vegetarian, or rather they say, I am a vegetarian, and then they eat meat, they're being a hypocrite, right? Because you could say that you're a vegetarian, but then eat meat. You can imagine that. But you can't actually be a vegetarian and also eat meat, right? So you could say one thing, but do another, but you can't be one thing and also be not that thing. So that's a important distinction, right? And that also involves what we said earlier about understanding the distinction between saying and doing, or words and things, right? Claims about actuality and actuality itself. So there's all different types of things you could throw in here. And how does this apply to claims and the concept of truth? Well, we would say a claim cannot simultaneously be true and false at the same time in the same way. That's why it's ultimately important. This stuff is important, but insofar as it relates to the concept of truth and claims, this is also important, right? So it's like, if you say the deficit is like more than $20 trillion, and that's true, the claim the deficit is less than $20 trillion can't then also be true. Like, right? It's either true or it's false. And this brings us to the very last principle, and we're going to stop after this. I don't even have to write it down because you don't have to memorize it. But there's this other law called the law of excluded middle, and that just is A or not A. As in, there's only 2 options. Right? Something is something, or it's not that thing. There's no third thing in between those things, right? And there's no third option that's neither of those things. It's either a cup or not a cup. There's no hybrid of cup and not cup. And there's nothing that is either cup, that is neither cup nor not cup. Or think about it in terms of truth. Like, a claim is either true or it's false. It can't be true and false, or neither true nor false. Like, it either corresponds to reality or it does not. It cannot correspond and also not correspond, right? That's all that means. So I think we stop there because I don't want this to be too long. Probably this video is a little longer than usually how long the lecture videos will be, because there was a lot to cover, and these are like important basic things. So I just wanted to make sure we got through everything, and then I explained everything sufficiently. So if after you watch this you are still confused about stuff, please feel free to reach out, right, through email, and I'll answer any specific questions you have, or sign up for an office hours slot, and I'll be available to do that, right? Check the syllabus for that, and also on Canvas. But other than that, I think we're good. So have a good day, guys. I'll see you around.